For decades, people assumed the silence in that studio after the playback was simply admiration. The truth was a little more complicated than that. It was a June afternoon in 1928 inside a recording studio in Chicago, a converted space on the upper floor of a downtown building with thick curtains hung along the walls to control the sound, a single large microphone positioned in the middle of the room, and a tangle of cables running toward a glass-walled booth where an engineer sat with headphones clamped over his ears, watching a needle cut grooves into a spinning wax disc. The room was small enough that the 5 musicians setting up that afternoon could hear each other breathing between takes. Outside, the city moved through its usual afternoon noise. Streetcars, traffic, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday. None of it audible inside the studio, where the curtains swallowed almost everything except the instruments themselves. Louis Armstrong stood near the microphone, trumpet in hand, going over the arrangement one more time with the rest of the band, a group that had by this point become known as the Hot Five, though the lineup had shifted over the past few years as Armstrong's reputation grew and the recordings themselves became something closer to events than routine studio work. They were there to record a song called West End Blues, a tune that had been written a few years earlier and recorded once already by another artist, though in a very different form. What Armstrong and his band were about to do with it had not been planned exactly in the way a modern listener might imagine planning, but it also wasn't entirely an accident. To understand why this particular afternoon mattered, it helps to understand where Louis Armstrong stood in his career at that moment and what recording sessions like this one had come to mean for him. By 1928, Armstrong had spent several years recording with small groups in Chicago studios, building a body of work that, song by song, had begun to shift the way trumpet players across the country thought about the instrument. He had come up through New Orleans, through the riverboats, through years of playing second cornet behind band leaders who kept the spotlight for themselves. But by this point, Armstrong was no longer anyone's second voice. The records he had been making, first with King Oliver's band, and then increasingly under his own name, had started to do something that record labels hadn't fully planned for. They had started to sell not because of the song or the band, but because of one player whose name had begun appearing larger on the label with each session. This shift placed Armstrong in an unusual position for a black musician in the recording industry of the late 1920s. Not simply a sideman whose contribution was interchangeable, but increasingly the reason a record existed at all. The pressure that came with that position was not something musicians of the era spoke about openly. But those who worked alongside Armstrong during these sessions later described a man who, despite his warmth and easy humor between takes, treated the actual recording with total seriousness, aware, in a way that was difficult to articulate, that what happened in a few minutes inside a small room could end up in homes and dance halls across the country, played over and over by people who would never know his face, only his sound. Beside Armstrong that afternoon was a pianist named Earl Hines, a young musician from Pittsburgh who had arrived in Chicago a few years earlier and quickly become known among other musicians as someone doing something genuinely new with the piano. Where most pianists of the era played in a steady, rolling style that anchored a band's rhythm, Hines had developed an approach that broke the melody into sharp, unpredictable phrases, playing the piano almost the way a horn player might, with sudden accents and silences that other musicians found, depending on their temperament, either thrilling or faintly unsettling. Armstrong and Hines had been playing together for some time by this point, and those who heard them together often described something unusual happening between the two of them. A kind of musical conversation where neither player simply supported the other, but where both seemed to be pushing each other towards something neither would have arrived at alone. This mattered for what was about to happen, because West End blues, as the band ran through it that afternoon, had an unusual structure, and at the very front of it sat a single decision that, depending on how it played out, could shape the entire feeling of the record. The song was meant to open with a brief instrumental passage before the rest of the band came in. A kind of introduction, the sort of thing that, on most recordings of the era, served as a short, functional lead-in to the main performance. Nothing more than a few bars, meant to set the key and the tempo before the song proper began. Armstrong, however, had been playing with the idea of doing something different with that opening. Not a short lead-in, but an extended passage, played entirely alone, with no band behind him at all. No rhythm section keeping time, no piano providing harmony. Just a trumpet, unaccompanied, in a recording studio where every imperfection would be captured exactly as it happened, with no way to hide a wrong note or a missed breath. This was, in the context of recordings at the time, an unusual choice. An unaccompanied opening meant there was nothing to lean on, no band to cover for a moment of hesitation, no rhythm to fall back into if something went wrong. It also meant that the very first sound on the record, the sound that would shape a listener's first impression before anything else happened, would be Armstrong completely alone. The band ran through the arrangement a few times before recording, not full takes, but the kind of loose run-throughs musicians do to settle into a song before the tape, or in this case the wax disc, started recording for real. During these run-throughs, those in the room later remembered, Armstrong's opening passage changed slightly each time. Not dramatically, but in small ways, phrases shifting, certain notes held a beat longer or cut a beat shorter, as though he were still, even in these final minutes before recording, searching for exactly the right shape for those opening bars. When the engineers signaled that they were ready, the room went quiet in the particular way recording studios went quiet in that era. Not just people stopping their conversations, but an entire room adjusting its breathing, its posture, its awareness of every small sound that might end up permanently captured on the disc. The needle began cutting into the wax, and Louis Armstrong raised his trumpet, alone, and began to play. What came out of the horn in those first several seconds was unlike anything that had opened a recording before it. A passage that moved with a freedom and a confidence that didn't sound rehearsed, even though it had been shaped, in pieces, over the run-throughs that preceded it. The notes bent and slid in ways that seemed to defy the strict rhythm most recordings of the era relied on, each phrase arriving with a sense of inevitability, as though Armstrong wasn't constructing the passage so much as discovering it in real time, even on a take that was being permanently etched into a record. The rest of the band came in after those opening bars, and the song continued, Hines's piano weaving through the arrangement with the same unpredictable energy that had made him stand out among other pianists, the band moving through the structure of the blues with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from musicians who had played together enough times to anticipate each other's choices. The take, by every account, went well. There was no obvious mistake, no moment where anyone in the room visibly reacted with concern. When it ended, the musicians lowered their instruments, and for a moment the room simply sat in the particular stillness that follows the end of a take. Neither relief nor excitement yet, just the pause before anyone says anything. Someone, accounts differ on exactly who, though it was likely either Armstrong himself or one of the engineers, suggested they listen back to what they had just recorded. This wasn't unusual. Playback during sessions was a practical necessity, a way of checking that the recording had captured properly, that the balance between instruments was right, that nothing had gone wrong with the equipment that wouldn't be obvious until it was too late to fix. The musicians gathered loosely around the playback equipment, the way people do when something is about to be replayed and no one is quite sure where to stand or what to do with their hands. The engineer started the playback. And the room went silent. Not the ordinary silence of people listening carefully, though it began that way, but something that extended past the moment when the opening passage ended and the rest of the band came in, past the point where, in an ordinary playback, someone might have nodded or smiled or made a small comment about the balance of the recording. The silence continued through the whole length of the track, and for a few seconds after it ended as well. For years afterward, when this moment was described by those who claimed to have been there, it was often framed simply as awe. A room full of musicians recognizing, the moment they heard it played back, that they had just been part of something extraordinary. And that was certainly part of it. Hearing a performance played back was different from playing it. In the room, each musician had been focused on their own part, their own timing, their own small decisions. On playback, for the first time, they heard the whole thing the way an audience would, as a single, complete sound, with Armstrong's opening passage now sitting at the very front of it, framing everything that followed. But those who knew the musicians well, and who heard the story told more carefully over the years, often pointed to something else as well, something quieter and a little harder to describe. The silence wasn't only about what they had just heard. It was about the fact that what they had just heard could not be done again. Not exactly. The opening passage that had just played back, the specific phrasing, the specific bends and pauses, the particular shape Armstrong had found only in this take after several run-throughs that had each been slightly different, existed now, permanently, on a single wax disc, in a form that even Armstrong himself, on a different day, in a different mood, might never reproduce exactly the same way again. For a group of musicians who spent their lives playing live, in rooms where a performance existed only for the people present and then disappeared, this was a strange thing to sit with. What they were hearing back was no longer a performance. It had become something else, fixed, permanent, no longer theirs in the way a live performance belonged to everyone in a room for as long as it lasted. It belonged now to whoever would eventually put the record on a turntable, in cities and rooms none of them would ever see. Armstrong, those present remembered, was quieter than usual during the playback. Not withdrawn, but listening in a way that seemed slightly different from how he usually listened to a take. Those close to him later suggested that what he was hearing in that moment wasn't only the music. It was the realization that this version of himself, this particular afternoon, this particular sequence of choices made almost instinctively over a few run-throughs, was now the version that would exist from this point forward, regardless of what he played afterward, regardless of how his style continued to change in the years to come. When the playback ended, the silence broke the way these things usually do. Someone exhaled, someone said something practical about whether they needed another take, and the ordinary rhythm of the session resumed. The record was approved. The musicians packed up their instruments, the engineer logged the take, and the afternoon continued the way recording afternoons did, with more songs still to record before the session ended. But West End Blues went on to become one of the most discussed recordings of its era, not only for what it contained, but for what it represented. The opening passage that Armstrong had played alone, the one that had silenced a room of musicians who had just spent the afternoon playing music together, became, for generations of listeners and musicians who came after, a kind of reference point. A moment that seemed to mark, More clearly than almost anything else from this period, the shift from jazz as ensemble music toward jazz as something that could also be carried briefly and completely by a single voice. What the silence in that studio revealed in the end wasn't simply that the musicians had recognized something great. It was that they had recognized something finished, a moment that had happened once, in a specific room, on a specific afternoon, and that none of them, including the man who had played it, would ever be able to fully step back into again. And somewhere on that wax disc, preserved exactly as it happened, that opening passage remains. A few seconds of a Tuesday afternoon in Chicago, played once, listened to in silence, and never quite repeated the same way again.